In the winter of 1896, the most ridiculous cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains was the one nobody could stop staring at. It wasn't beside the river, it wasn't on the flat. It stood 60 feet above the valley floor on a strip of hard, stony ground that looked fit for nothing except regret. Every bucket had to be carried uphill. Every log had to be dragged uphill. Every sensible man in the valley agreed on what would happen next. The widow would last until the first real cold, and then she'd crawl back down. But January came, and the cabins by the river turned into wet wooden refrigerators. Stoves roared all night. Ice bloomed on the inside of the glass. Water froze in buckets only a few steps from the fire. Up on the bench, the widow's cabin was still cold, but it was dry, calm, and livable. Her son could still turn the pages of a book. The lamp oil on her porch still poured. That was the part nobody could explain. How could the harder place be the easier place to survive? The answer wasn't in the logs. It wasn't in the stove. It wasn't in grit. It was in the behavior of air. This is the story of a woman who understood one invisible rule of mountain country better than everyone around her. And because she understood it, she spent one of the worst winters in Montana standing just outside the place where the cold was strongest. Her name was Vitek, and long before she ever saw the Bitterroots, she had already been taught the lesson that saved her life. Mara grew up in the eastern hills of Moravia, where fruit trees paid more attention to elevation than men did. A stranger would look at those hills and assume the safest ground was in the hollows. Deeper soil, more water, less wind, safe. But spring kept exposing the lie. Some mornings, the orchards in the low folds of land were silver with frost, while the trees halfway up the slope stood dark, wet, untouched. Plant by convenience, and you lost blossoms. Plant by air, and you kept the crop. Mara's father had no language for meteorology. He had apricots to protect, and years of failure behind him. So he taught his daughter the only lesson that mattered. The cold settles. It goes looking for the bottom the way water does. If you let your trees sleep in that bowl, you lose them. Mara learned to read hollows the way some people read faces. She noticed where mist lingered too long, which meadow corners browned first after a cold snap, which cheap parcels carried the most expensive mistake. Years later, after marriage took her west and widowhood pushed her farther still, that lesson remained. Her husband, Joseph, died in a mill accident outside Missoula. The money went with the funeral. The promises of steady work went with the season. Remained was Mara, her 14-year-old son Pavel, a wagon with too little in it, and a rumor that land farther south could still be claimed if a family was willing to live hard enough. So they went south. The valley they found was beautiful, and immediately deceptive. A clear river cut through cottonwoods on the floor. The ground beside it was dark and level. There were already cabins down there, each one placed according to the logic people trusted most. Stay near water, stay on level earth. Do not make your life harder than it needs to be. Mara rented a one-room shack on the valley bottom for the winter. By the third night, she knew something was wrong. The stove worked, the walls were decent, the roof held, and still the cold inside that little room felt meaner than the cold outdoors. Not the clean bite of winter air, a damp, settled, body-draining cold that seemed to sit in the corners and wait. When Pavel rose before dawn to fetch water, the rope at the well cracked like stiff leather in his hands. Their blankets never seemed fully dry. Steam from cooking hung low, then glazed itself onto the window frame. More than once, Mara woke to find a pale rim of ice in the wash basin, with embers still glowing in the stove. Other families were fighting the same battle. Smoke columns climbed from their chimneys every morning, and burned there all day long. Wood vanished, cabins never truly warmed. The neighbors blamed bad timber, weak stoves, bad chinking, bad luck. Mara blamed the land. On clear evenings, she stepped outside and watched the smoke. It did something she had seen in Moravia and never forgotten. It rose a little, then flattened, and drifted through the valley in a low gray band, as if an unseen ceiling had pressed down over the settlement. The ridges darkened first, then the draws began leaking cold into the bottom like spilled water. She didn't have the modern phrase for it. She had the old one from home, a frost hollow. By December, she understood the valley's geometry with frightening clarity. The cabins by the river were not merely in winter. They were in the place where winter came to collect. In late August, once her claim papers were nearly ready, Mara walked the length of the valley with Pavel and did something that made him deeply uneasy. She ignored the good parcels. She ignored the easy parcels. She ignored every stretch of ground that would have made water hauling sensible and building simple. Instead, she studied the sidewalls. Pavel kept pointing downhill. There, Mama. Flat ground, grass, easy path to the river. Mara kept shaking her head. By afternoon they reached a narrow shelf on the eastern side of the valley, beneath scattered pine and broken rock. Thin soil, bad cart access, the river flashing far below like a strip of tin. No farmer in his right mind would have called it prime ground. Mara stopped there. "This one," she said. Pavel stared at the slope, then at the river, then back at his mother. "We'll carry every pail by hand." "Yes." "We'll drag logs up here." "Yes." "Why?" "Because down there," she said, pointing to the valley floor, "the night gets deeper than it looks." That answer sounded like mystery, but Mara wanted proof her son could see. That evening, just after sunset, when the air went still, she filled a small iron pan with damp juniper and a few live coals. The smoke came up thick, white, slow. She handed the pan to Pavel and took 3 fence stakes under one arm. "Walk downhill. Stop every 10 paces. Hold the pan still." At the first stop, the smoke curled upward, then drifted across the bench. At the second, it lifted less. At the third, only a little farther down, it changed all at once. Instead of thinning into the evening, it pressed low, spread sideways, and began creeping along the slope as if it had found the surface of an invisible pond. Mara planted a stake. A few paces lower, the smoke hugged the ground harder and slid toward the bottom of the valley. She planted a second, then she led Pavel back uphill. "Below this line," she said, "the cold will stack up every clear night. Above it, we still have winter. But we do not have the worst of where winter settles." He looked downhill at the smoke dragging itself through the grass. For the first time, he understood. His mother was not choosing harder work for the sake of being stubborn. She was trading one kind of labor for another. Carry water in daylight, or feed the stove all night for months. From the valley bottom, their decision looked insane. Rufus Hale said so openly. Hale had come from Iowa and trusted broadland, level wheels, and plain arithmetic. He rode up while Mara and Pavel were levering foundation stones into place. "You planning to punish yourself all winter?" he called. Mara straightened, wiped her forehead, looked at him without hurry. Hale pointed down to the river. "You've got water down there, hay down there, wagon room down there. Up here you get wind and a broken back." Mara glanced toward the valley floor. "Easy ground has its own bill," she said. Hale laughed once. Then he looked at the path they had cut up the slope, shook his head, and rode away with the expression of a man who believes he has given fair warning. By October, half the valley had an opinion about the Vitek woman on the bench. Most of those opinions were the same. She had mistaken difficulty for wisdom. The cabin went up anyway. Every log cost more effort than it would have below. Every chimney stone had to be hauled by hand. Water barrels became an exhausting climb. Pavel complained at first, then stopped, because complaining did not lighten the barrels. Mara made one concession. She built larger casks and hauled less often. That, too, the neighbors called ridiculous. Why build farther from water, and then make the water heavier? Because Mara understood something they did not. A difficult trip performed once every 2 days can still be cheaper than a losing fight fought every hour of every night. The first hard cold came in November. The second came in December. Then, in the second week of January, the valley was hit by the kind of weather people talk about for decades afterward. An Arctic high settled over western Montana, beneath a sky so brutally clear it seemed to sharpen every sound. The river edges locked first, then the backwater pools, then the whole valley floor glittered before dawn like ground glass. For 6 days, the temperature in the bottom never climbed into comfort. At night, it dropped into a range where iron burns skin, and breath freezes into beards after 2 sentences. Down by the river, life narrowed to survival. The Hales fed their stove until the cast iron glowed, and still could not drive the chill out of the walls. Frost feathered from the corners of the window frame. The bedding stayed clammy. The packed earth floor felt like a cellar packed with snow. Rufus's youngest girl developed a cough that deepened whenever the fire fell low. His wife kept kettles steaming in a losing war against the stove's dry heat, and the wet cold pressing through everything else. He counted with the way other men count money, when they know the account is draining too fast. 3 sled loads vanished. Then another. A week's fuel became 3 days. He stopped talking about weather and started talking about supply. The cabins around him were no better. Men who prided themselves on tight joints found ice edging the inside of their doors. Women set bread dough near the stove and still watched the far side of the bowl stiffen. At dawn, the whole settlement looked as if it had been dipped in white salt from roofline to fence rail. Up on the bench, Mara's cabin was not warm in any luxurious sense. It was not a miracle. It was simply normal enough to live in. The fire burned steady instead of frantic. The air stayed dry enough that bedding remained usable. Pavel could sit at the table and read figures from an old seed ledger without warming his hands over the stove lid every few minutes. A slab of lard could still be cut instead of hacked. The water bucket stayed liquid, and at dawn, the oil flask on the porch still tilted and poured. It was not spring up there. It was still winter. But it was winter, with its throat loosened. Even so, the bench was not free of strain. The path to the river turned treacherous under crusted snow. A crosswind rattled the shutter latch one night, hard enough to wake Pavel straight out of sleep. On the 4th morning of the cold spell, he slipped on the descent, came back with one knee bleeding through his wool trousers, and a temper to match. Maybe Hale was right, he snapped. But he should be living on a slope like this. Mara wrapped the knee, set more water to heat, then opened the door and let the outside air touch his face. Look at the valley, she said. Below them, the river bottom lay under a film of pale vapor and would smoke. Less like a settlement, more like a basin being slowly filled. You think the cold is everywhere because winter is everywhere, Mara said. It isn't. Not equally. That lesson would be proved 2 mornings later by a hungry cow and a man who had run out of reasons not to believe his own skin. Rufus Hale woke before daylight to a noise outside his shed. One of his cows, half-starved and frantic from the cold, had broken through a weakened panel and wandered upslope toward the hay Mara kept under a lean-to behind her cabin. Rufus swore, grabbed a rope, and went after her. The air on the valley floor hit like a blow. Each inhale scraped. The cold there had weight to it, as though the whole bottom of the valley had been packed with invisible iron filings of frost. He trudged upward, expecting misery to increase with elevation, because that was how every sensible person understood mountains, Higher meant colder. Always. For the first stretch, his belief held. Then he climbed into something he could not explain. It happened within a handful of steps. The cold did not vanish. It changed. The cutting edge went out of it. He stopped in the snow, confused enough to forget the cow. He took 2 more steps. Again. Still cold, yes, but no longer predatory. No longer reaching through wool with the same vicious speed. He pulled off one mitten and held out his bare hand, just for a moment. Below, that would have been a fool's trick. Here, it was merely unpleasant. Rufus looked downhill. Now the difference was visible. The cottonwoods lower in the valley were furred in heavier white. The roofs sat inside a low gray band of trapped smoke. Even sounds seemed duller down there, as if the basin were holding not only cold, but weight. He looked up. Mara's cabin stood above him under clean air. Snow clung to the north side of the chimney stones, but the porch rails were not armored in rime the way his own fence had been at dawn. A thread of smoke rose from her chimney and kept rising. For the first time, the structure of the valley shifted in his mind. The river bottom was not the safe place. It was the sump. Mara found him a few minutes later coaxing the cow away from her hay with more embarrassment than force. He did not begin with an apology. Men like Rufus almost never do. He began with the only question that mattered. How much warmer is it up here? Mara considered him. On nights like this. Enough. That answer should have irritated him. Instead, it made him laugh once, short and breathless, because it sounded exactly like the kind of answer a man receives after ignoring the truth for too long. She invited him inside. Rufus stepped over the threshold and understood the rest of it immediately. Not luxury, not tropical warmth, dry boards, a controlled fire, no ice shining on the inside of the window, no desperate overheating, no sense that the room was losing a war minute by minute. Pavel sat at the table with a book. Mara was slicing salt pork. A pail near the wall remained liquid. This was what undid him. Not comfort, ordinariness. The valley below had been living in emergency. Mara had been living in weather. What she knew can be explained now with the language science later supplied. On clear nights, slopes and ridges lose heat fast by radiation to the open sky. The air touching those surfaces cools first. As it cools, it becomes denser. And once it becomes denser, gravity takes over. That chilled air drains downhill. It slips through timber. It pours through gullies. It spreads across meadows. It gathers in the lowest available ground the exact way water would if the valley were being filled from the edges. Meteorologists now call that cold air drainage. Farmers and orchardists have lived with it far longer than meteorologists have named it. When enough of that dense air pools in the bottom, the valley forms a temperature inversion. For a certain band of elevation, going uphill can actually make you warmer, not colder, because you are climbing out of the lake of settled cold and into what modern building science calls the thermal belt. That was the belt Mara had chosen. She had not built a better stove. She had not discovered magical firewood. She had simply refused to place her cabin at the lowest point in a nightly flood of dense air. The cabins by the river were trying to heat themselves while sitting in the deepest part of that invisible pool. Every wall, every crack, every floorboard was pressed against colder air for longer hours. Move the house 60 feet uphill, and the whole night changes. Rufus carried that truth downhill before noon. He told his wife first, then the next cabin, then anyone who would listen without making him repeat himself twice. And he did not frame it as folklore or superstition or women's intuition. He framed it the way practical men trust anything, as something he had tested with his own face. You can walk into the line, he said. You can feel it. Some did not believe him. Humiliation makes people stubborn. But disbelief weakened fast once the cold spell ended, and curious men climbed the slope for themselves at dawn. They stood below Mara's bench in bitter air, climbed 20 or 30 paces higher, and felt the same softening Rufus had felt. By March, the valley possessed a new piece of local knowledge. By spring, it possessed a new map. Edwin Sorrell, the clerk who handled land descriptions in the nearest town, began asking newcomers one extra question before he inked their claim notes. Do you want easy water or winters? It sounded like a joke the first time. It stopped sounding like one after enough families returned to say the Vitek woman had been right. He started marking benches and mid-slope shoulders more carefully on his rough sketches. Word spread from cabin talk to claim talk to planting talk. The next fruit trees in that valley were not set beside the river. They were set above it. The next cabins were not clustered entirely on the bottom. They began appearing in a loose line along the shoulders of the valley wall, each one an admission that comfort in mountain country is not decided only by timber, labor, or courage. Sometimes it is decided by where you choose to stand in a moving sea of air. Modern architects still pay attention to this. So do vineyard owners. So do orchardists protecting blossoms from late frost. The principle is neither quaint nor mystical, it is physical, measurable, and often ignored until somebody suffers enough to notice it. That is why Mara Vitek's cabin matters. Not because she was braver than everyone else, not because she loved hardship, not because frontier stories require a stubborn genius on a hill. Her cabin matters because it exposed a humiliating truth. What looks easiest on the ground can be catastrophically wrong in the air. The valley's common sense had not been stupid, it had simply been incomplete. Water mattered. Flat ground mattered. Access mattered. But another force mattered too. And because it could not be seen, most people never thought to give it a vote. Mara did. She carried water farther in daylight so winter would not sit in her bedroom all night. She accepted the steep path because she understood the hidden map beneath the visible one. She chose the harder site, and got the easier season. That is what wisdom often looks like. Not a miracle. Not a secret trick. Just a person noticing the invisible rule everyone else has been paying for. If this changed the way you think about mountains, weather, or old world building knowledge, let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories where practical intelligence beats surface logic, stay with us. There are a lot of invisible maps left to read.